Deep in the frozen, unforgiving wilderness of the northern Ural Mountains lies a place the indigenous Mansi people call Kholat Syakhl. In their native tongue, it translates to something chilling, Dead Mountain. It is a desolate, jagged peak completely exposed to the violent Siberian winds. Nothing grows there. Nothing survives there. And yet, in the dead of winter in 1959, 9 highly experienced, fiercely athletic hikers decided to pitch a tent on its freezing slopes. They would never be seen alive again. What happened to them that night remains one of the most baffling, terrifying, and fiercely debated unsolved mysteries in modern human history. It wasn't just that they died in the cold. It was how they died. When investigators finally found their bodies weeks later, the scene defied all logic. The hikers had slashed their own tent open from the inside, fleeing into sub-zero temperatures in their socks, and, in some cases, barely in their underwear. But they didn't freeze peacefully. Some were found with their skulls fractured by a force equal to a brutal car crash. Some had chest traumas so severe their ribs were shattered. One was missing her tongue. Another was missing his eyes. And strangest of all, traces of high-level radioactive contamination were found on their clothing. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass Incident, a mystery that, even today, defies explanation. To understand the tragedy, we have to look at the victims. This was not a group of foolish amateurs. They were students and graduates of the Ural Polytechnical Institute, led by a 23-year-old engineering student named Igor Dyatlov. Dyatlov was a wilderness expert, deeply respected by his peers. He had assembled a team of 8 men and 2 women for a daunting 190-mile expedition. Their goal was to reach Mount Otorten and earn their Grade 3 hiker certification, the highest, most difficult rank available in the Soviet Union. To earn this, a hiker had to prove they could survive the harshest environments on Earth. They were young, fit, intelligent, and carrying state-of-the-art survival gear for the era. They knew exactly what they were doing. On January 23, 1959, the group began their journey. They traveled by train and trucked to a remote settlement, the last outpost of civilization before the infinite wide expanse of the wilderness. Here, a twist of fate saved a life. One of the hikers, Yuri Yudin, developed severe joint pain and a sudden illness. Reluctantly, he hugged his friends goodbye and turned back. He would be the only member of the expedition to survive. The remaining 9 pressed on, venturing deep into the snow-choked forests on skis. For days, things went perfectly. We know this because they carried cameras and kept detailed journals. Their final photographs show them smiling, breaking trail through the powder, and setting up camp. But as January turned to February, the weather turned violently against them. On February 1st, a blinding snowstorm struck. Visibility dropped to 0, and the temperature plummeted to -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Disoriented by the whiteout, the group accidentally deviated from their planned route. Instead of navigating through the sheltered valley, they found themselves climbing the barren, exposed slope of Kholat Syakhl Dead Mountain. Realizing their mistake, Dyatlov made a controversial decision. Instead of hiking a mile downhill into the forest, where the trees would protect them from the wind, he ordered the group to pitch their tent right there on the exposed mountainside. Perhaps he didn't want to lose the altitude they had fought so hard to gain. Perhaps he wanted to practice surviving in extreme exposure. Whatever the reason, it was a fatal choice. They ate a cold dinner, changed into their sleeping clothes, and went to bed. They would never wake up to see the sunrise. Dyatlov had promised to send a telegram to their sports club as soon as they returned to civilization, estimating they would be back by February 12th. But the 12th came and went with total silence. At first, no one panicked. Delays in the brutal Russian winter were common. But as a week passed, the parents of the hikers demanded action. On February 20th, the Institute launched a massive rescue operation, quickly joined by the Soviet military and helicopters scanning the white abyss from above. For nearly a week, they found nothing but endless drifts of snow. The mountains had seemingly swallowed 9 people whole. Then, on February 26th, a search pilot spotted something jutting out of the snow on the slope of Dead Mountain. It was the ruined remains of a canvas tent. When the search party reached the tent, what they found sent a chill down their spines. The tent was half torn down and completely covered in snow. Inside, the investigators found the group's heavy winter coats, their boots, their food, and all their survival gear meticulously organized. The hikers were gone, but it was the tent itself that provided the first terrifying clue. The side of the heavy canvas had been slashed open. Investigators later determined that it hadn't been torn by the wind, and it hadn't been slashed from the outside by an attacker. The cuts were made from the inside. Something had terrified these 9 experienced survivalists so completely that they didn't even bother to untie the door. They cut their way out of the tent and fled into a -20-degree blizzard without their boots, without their coats, and blindly into the dark. Trailing away from the slashed tent, the search party found footprints. 8 or 9 sets of tracks heading down the mountain toward the tree line, nearly a mile away. The tracks were bizarre. Some prints showed a person wearing only a single sock. Others showed bare feet. One set indicated someone wearing a single boot. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, and no footprints of any other humans or animals. The hikers had walked, not run down the deadly slope in a unified group. The investigators followed the freezing trail for nearly a mile until the footprints vanished under the shifting snow near the edge of the forest. There, beneath the sprawling branches of a massive, ancient cedar tree, they made their first grim discovery. At the edge of the forest, under the towering cedar, were the remains of a small, pathetic fire. Next to it lay the frozen bodies of 2 hikers, Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko. Both men were dressed only in their underwear. They were shoeless, and their bodies were covered in abrasions. Looking up, the searchers noticed something bizarre. The branches of the cedar tree were snapped and broken up to 15 feet high. The men had been frantically climbing the tree, tearing their skin in the process. Were they trying to get a better view of the tent? Or were they trying to escape from something stalking them on the ground? Blood and skin were found embedded in the tree bark, proving they had climbed it in a state of sheer panic. Between the cedar tree and the abandoned tent, searchers found 3 more bodies: Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Rustem Slobodin. Based on their positions, they had died attempting to crawl back up the mountain toward the tent. Dyatlov was found on his back, clutching a small birch branch, his face frozen in a defensive posture. Kolmogorova had blood on her face, and Slobodin had a fractured skull. Though the medical examiner claimed the fracture was not fatal, and he ultimately died of Hypothermia. For all 5 of these victims, the official cause of death was listed as freezing. It seemed like a tragic, albeit incredibly bizarre, case of exposure, but for hikers were still missing. It would take 2 more months for the brutal Siberian winter to thaw enough to reveal the true horror of Dead Mountain. In May 1959, the snow finally began to melt. Deep in the woods, about 250 feet from the cedar tree, investigators found a steep ravine hollowed out by a flowing stream. Buried under 13 feet of snow lay the final 4 bodies. What they found here completely shattered the hypothermia theory. These 4 hikers had suffered catastrophic, unexplainable injuries. Nikolai Thibeaux-Brignoles had a skull fracture so severe his bone was driven into his brain. Lyudmila Dubinina and Semyon Zolotaryev had massive chest fractures. The medical examiner, Dr. Boris Vozrozdeny, testified that the force required to cause such damage was equal to a high-speed car crash. Yet, bafflingly, there were no external wounds. The skin was perfectly intact, but their insides were completely crushed. As if the crushed ribs weren't terrifying enough, the autopsy revealed even darker details. The bodies in the ravine were found wearing the clothes of the hikers who had died at the cedar tree. They had cut the clothing off their dead friends' frozen bodies to try and keep warm. But the most horrifying discovery was the facial trauma. Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her eyes, her lips, and her entire tongue. Semyon Zolotaryev was also missing his eyes. The Soviet investigators quickly classified the autopsy reports as top secret, burying the files deep in the state archives. They concluded that a compelling natural force had caused the deaths, abruptly closed the case, and banned anyone from entering the mountain pass for 3 years. But the secrets didn't stay buried. Decades later, when the Soviet Union collapsed, researchers finally gained access to the unredacted files. They discovered a detail the military had desperately tried to hide: radiation. Forensics had tested the clothing of the hikers found in the ravine. 2 of the garments, a sweater and a pair of trousers, were heavily contaminated with beta radiation. There is absolutely no reason for hikers in the pristine wilderness to be covered in radioactive isotopes. Furthermore, relatives who attended the funerals claimed the victim's skin had turned a deep shade of brown or orange, and their hair had turned completely gray. Why would a simple hiking accident involve radiation, closed casket funerals, and military cover-ups? The theories exploded. The most grounded theory is an avalanche. Modern scientists suggest that when the hikers cut into the snowy slope to pitch their tent, they destabilized a massive slab of hard-packed snow. Hours later, a block of ice the size of a car slid down, crushing the tent and shattering the ribs of the hikers inside. Panicking and suffocating, they slashed the tent open and dragged their critically injured friends out. Knowing another avalanche could hit, they fled to the tree line. But the avalanche theory has massive holes. Searchers found the tent mostly upright, with ski poles still sticking vertically in the snow. An avalanche would have swept everything away. Furthermore, the slope of Dead Mountain was only 30 degrees, widely considered too shallow for a slab avalanche to occur. If it wasn't an avalanche, what was it? The presence of radiation points to a much darker theory: covert military testing at the exact time of the hikers' deaths. Another group of campers 50 miles away reported seeing glowing, Fiery orange orbs in the night sky over Kholat Syakhl were the hikers victims of an experimental Soviet weapon. A parachute mine detonating in the air above the tent could explain the massive concussive force that crushed their chests without breaking their skin. It would explain the blinding flash of light, the radiation, and the military's aggressive cover-up. Did the hikers wake up to an explosion, flee the radioactive fallout blindly into the dark, and slowly succumb to the elements? Other theories delve into the psychological. Some acoustic engineers believe the specific shape of Dead Mountain creates a phenomenon called a Kármán vortex street. The brutal winds whipping around the dome of the mountain could have produced infrasound, low-frequency sound wave inaudible to the human ear, but known to cause intense nausea, panic attacks, and sheer, unexplained terror in the human brain. Did the mountain itself drive them mad, forcing them to tear their way out of their only shelter in a desperate bid to escape an invisible tormentor? Or was it something entirely unknown? We will likely never know for sure. The only witnesses to what happened that night are the towering cedar tree, the freezing wind, and Dead Mountain itself. The 9 hikers were buried in a mass grave in Sverdlovsk, their legacy permanently etched into history. The Dyatlov Pass remains open, a silent tomb waiting for the next brave soul to ask it a question it will never answer. What do you think forced them out of that tent? Let me know in the comments below, and subscribe for more mysteries.